Okay, thanks for joining today for our mobile deposit benchmark report study discussion. My name is Kerry Cantley. I'm the VP of Digital Banking Strategy here at Mitek, and I'll be hosting our webinar today. Joining me to actually discuss the survey and our benchmark report results are Mike Diamond, who is the General Manager for Digital Banking with Mitek, and Ron Shevlin, who is the Chief Research Officer, Cornerstone Advisors, and they're going to be walking us through the findings. So just as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question during the webinar, you can submit those questions in the question box. So let's get started. As we talk about the survey and the benchmark report, Mike and Ron, how about giving us a little bit of a history around the report and how the studies was conducted this past year? So Mike, you want to talk a little bit about history, and then Ron, you can talk to us a little bit about the survey and how the study was conducted.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Kerry. I'll keep it short because I don't think anybody jumped on here to listen to the history of the mobile banking benchmark study. But it is interesting to talk about one of the things that we focus on at Mitek from a culture perspective is a learning culture. And the other thing is that I'm convinced that learning and sharing your work is really kind of good for all participants, and that's what we're all participants in trying to drive better behaviors, digital banking behaviors that drive operational effectiveness and higher net promoter scores for consumers and businesses. And so that was the genesis around the mobile deposit benchmarking study to help us learn together about what the best practices are, what the implications of those practices are around adoption and so forth. And then we've just been building on the report all along. It's just been an awful lot of fun to work on this and to collaborate with a group like Cornerstone. And with that, I'll pass it over to Ron to talk about some of the more specifics more recently.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mike. And thanks a lot for having us work with you on this. So the past couple of years, we basically have been collaborating with another company, a digital strategy design agency called CINT, who actually goes in and accesses live accounts to evaluate the mobile deposit experience for 20 of the largest financial institutions in the US. They've done that every year for the past, I guess, 6 or 7 or so, since we've been working with them for the past 4 or 5. And so we look at, or they look at 8 different heuristics, 2 policy areas and 6 user experience categories. Over the past couple of years, we've actually evolved the methodology a little bit. A few years ago, we started surveying consumers as well to understand their needs, their expectations, and their experiences. And this year actually expanded it to small business owners as well to gauge their attitudes, usage, and behavioral reactions to both mobile deposit and mobile banking, and have expanded the numbers that we've been including. So research methodology has been evolving. We've been doing more surveys to back this up, and even that's been evolving as well to include small businesses, and really looking forward to sharing that because I know that's a very high priority for a lot of financial institutions these days, and I think the findings are really interesting.
Yeah, it's always good from a survey perspective to have data on the utility itself as well as the customer experience. So it makes a lot of sense from a research perspective to bring those together. So thanks so much for sharing that. Let's jump right into some of the recent market trends, kind of the check fraud, some of the customer sentiment experience. And like you said, Ron, small business was something we really wanted to understand a little bit more about. They're an important aspect of the product solutions that financial institutions provide. So we're going to talk today about market trends, that perspective. We're going to talk about the experience rankings, and then maybe a little bit of that futuristic look ahead, like what are the emerging concerns and how does that look when we talk about not only the survey, but the utility scoring that's been used to gather the data. So Ron, kind of based on where we are with check volume, and checks as a payment method from the survey results, can you talk to us a little bit about the consumer perspective, kind of the trends, the sentiment, some interesting statistics that you want to share with us today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on one hand, I think there's a lot of good news here in this space. I think there's very high usage and satisfaction. 8 out of 10 consumers said that mobile deposit is a critical or important feature to their mobile banking experience. In general, the satisfaction levels are increasing, not by a huge amount, but you know what? Even a point or two each year is pretty significant to move the needle. And saw that overall satisfaction levels are just below sort of a 90 level, which is pretty good, but increased from 2022 to 2023. And also saw very high utilization and satisfaction from a small business owner perspective as well. When it came to things like problems and issues, the percentage of people who had problems have declined, and the issues that they have are not particularly predominant or prevalent. And before we kind of go to the next slide, Mike, did you want to kind of jump in with a few observations as well before we kind of move on to other stats and things like that?
I just think the only thing I'll add is that, and we've seen this before, mobile deposit turns the phone not just what's my balance, but it turns it into a transactional device. And that's one of the things that has been the real game changer here. And well, there was a huge spike during COVID, right? A lot of people were forced into the future as it relates to mobile deposit, kind of the laggards. A lot of those people, and I heard this just a million times. A lot of people, when they did it the first time after kind of refusing to do it for a lot of years, uttered almost exactly the same phrase, which is, wow, that's really easy. And those people are true believers, and very few of them are going back to the way they did it before.
Yeah, if we go to the next slide too, I do want to highlight something else from a utilization perspective. It's something I know I look for every year, is understanding, well, what about for people who don't deposit their checks or all of their checks with a mobile device, why not? This year, as well as in previous years, the most prevalent response is that they were in or near a branch or an ATM. And then from there, the answers kind of really go down. But a couple of things I'd want to point out here. Number one, a quarter of people said that they didn't deposit a check because it exceeded their single check limit. The percentage who said that jumped pretty high, or it was a significant jump from the previous year. And then you get the 1 out of 5 who say they had technical difficulties or forgot to use their mobile device. You know, what this tells me is that there's still a lot of education and opportunity that that can be had and needs to be delivered. The fact that somebody was in a branch or near an ATM and says that that's why they deposited a mobile device, I mean, look, it's still way more convenient to just, I don't care where you are, you could be standing outside the branch, take a picture, then going to the machine, putting the checks in, or God forbid, stand in line in the branch, although there might not be much of a line in the branch these days, who knows, but still got to be more convenient. And so even for those who said that they were in or near a branch or an ATM, makes me think that they're doing that because they think that the check will clear faster than doing it through the mobile device. So I think this tells me there's still a lot of education that can be done.
Yeah, and Ron, I would say, I looked at, a lot of the different questions and answers, and I think the keywords funds availability kept popping up throughout that, right? It did, you see it here on this slide, but I think funds availability is that other deciding factor. And some consumers know which channels actually provide them, right, faster funds availability in their account. So it's something that the financial institutions, could really gain some insights maybe from some of the data that's in here, but that thought perspective for customers is they believe there's a difference in experience when it comes to their funds availability, whether there is or not, right? That's what they believe. That's something that I noticed in the survey as well. Anything else to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add that one of the ironies is that consumers and users of this service don't understand that all checks are imaged, no matter where they're going. And so a lot of times when I'm talking to people who convey some concern about using mobile, I said, well, when you go to a branch, you're basically getting a car, driving someplace, walking into a store and handing your check to somebody saying, would you take a picture of this for me? And the same sort of true for the ATM. I'm going to go drive in or walk and find a scanner and go feed my check into it, right? And so when people, it's always like you see this light bulb pop on when you say that to them. Similarly, I'll just add in here that when people indicate a concern about using the technology around safety and all that, and I always say that point out to them that the bank is the one taking the risk because you still have the check. And those are two kind of very common things. Like when you say that to people, literally, you just see that light bulb pop on, and those are the sorts of things that it takes to kind of get people to use the service.
Education, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So kind of as we think through sentiment and trends, access, and some of the other things that are going on from a trend perspective, I think the other thing that I started to see in this survey was, and we all know it's apparent, right? Their concern around fraud.
Kerry, before we go there, sorry to interrupt, but there was a question came in. I think it's probably good if we just address it while we're talking about it. The question was, what is the single check limit? Is the amount a regulatory item or is it a bank policy? Personally, I'm not sure, but I don't believe it's a regulatory limit. Mike, are you familiar?
It's a bank thing, and frankly, not just a bank thing, but a bank and customer thing, right? You know, you can have smart limits, and one customer gets different limits than somebody else because of some behaviors and all that.
Great. Sorry to cut you off there, Kerry. I just want to make sure we address the
absolutely. Thanks, Ron, for catching that question. I appreciate that. So do we want to talk a little bit about the concerns that some of the consumers and through the survey results we noticed, which was around fraud and check fraud and general fraud as the holistic who I am and as well as the payment methods. Do we want to talk, Mike, a little bit about why they're so worried and some of the headlines that we've seen over the past years with check fraud?
Sure, yeah. And I think that that's coming up, but listen, you can't turn on your, you can't watch any kind of a news item from your local coverage. If you wait long enough, you'll find a story about so-and-so mail theft, postal carrier, there you go, thank you. Postal carrier was accosted in their arrow key, and the arrow key is the magical little key that postal carriers all have that open up not just a mailbox in a small area, but in a huge area around there. And so, and then you have, of course, insider fraud and all the rest of it. But the reality is that check fraud is rising because big problems don't arise because of one thing. They arise because of lots of reasons. And the prevalence of internet-based scams, romance scams, work-from-home scams, the flood of government stimulus checks that went out during COVID, the number of YouTube and social media influencers and so forth that kind of provide a very easy how-to for people who are aspiring fraudsters. All those things, mail theft, all that, all combined together, and they serve to kind of become a fuel that has supercharged check fraud in the last few years. You know, the channels are the same, right? The branch has been there. The mobile deposit was always there before that. ATMs were always there before. I do point out with my tongue firmly planted in cheek that it's the only time in the history of banking where it's socially acceptable to walk into a branch or up to a camera wearing a mask. And so all those things, they all work together to create this massive problem. You see in the lower right-hand corner about the 84% increase in check fraud. I would say, based on my experience working with financial institutions, that's probably low.
Yeah, and what in the survey results we saw a significant was it 70% were concerned, right? Consumers are highly concerned about some kind of fraud and check fraud, especially in that small business. Those results were kind of astounding to me in terms of their considerations and concern around check fraud and that they've experienced it. So it is prevalent, it is everywhere, and it is significantly impacting experience as well as losses, right? Risk, loss, all of those implications are there when it comes to check fraud. So Ron, how about we dive a little bit deeper into some of those consumer and small business stats? Like you said, with the study going a little deeper on small business, there were some very interesting findings there that I think were pretty kind of not necessarily surprising, but provides some significant opportunities from a value of just understanding where small businesses are today.
Yeah, absolutely. Do want to just make a quick comment about the consumer side before we move on, because we had skipped over a slide. The slide heading said that there was 2/3 of consumers who were concerned with various forms of fraud and implications of fraud. And I think one of the things that's important to recognize is that in last year's survey, we asked similar questions, and it came out to be around a little over half of consumers. For that to jump to 2/3 of consumers, and even slightly higher with some of the individual points, that's a lot. And it's not just driven by the news, it is driven by their experience. A little over 1 out of 10 consumers told us that they have experienced some form of check fraud. And then on the small business side, on the next slide, if you would, Aaron, we asked them to basically rate to what extent is check fraud a concern, and nearly half said it was a big concern. And again, this is being driven a lot by their experience. Almost 1/3 of them say that they have been victimized by some form of check fraud, and 2/3 of them who have reported losses that exceed $50,000, which is on the next slide, Aaron, if you would. So this is certainly becoming very prevalent on the top of minds. By the way, I know we're very focused today on check fraud, but from a small business perspective, in a separate survey that Cornerstone had conducted a couple of months ago, also found that things like payment fraud is also rampant and prevalent. So while we're talking today about check fraud, I think it's important to recognize that from a banker's perspective, their small business customers are dealing with a huge amount of fraud from all different angles right now. And this is becoming almost epidemic in its impact for small business.
So a question kind of came into line a little bit with what you're saying here around, payment fraud versus check fraud. The question was, has the improvements in card-based fraud monitoring tools contributed to fraudsters moving to checks? Mike or Ron, do you have any indications from either survey statistics, kind of data in the industry around kind of how they're moving? Like you said, Ron, from payment method to payment method, we know that all payment methods are, right, potentially, have an issue at one time or another with fraud, but some of that strengthening of one payment method, is it pushing maybe to more fraud in the check space?
Mike.
Yeah, sure, I will. And as a matter of fact, so just to reiterate the question is, are we seeing kind of like squeezing the balloon, like less people are working on that? And there's a question, by the way, has the improvements in card-based fraud monitoring tools contributed to fraudsters moving to checks, which is really, I think, related to exactly what we're talking about. And the answer to that specifically is, whenever you close one door, another door looks more attractive, right? I would say that one of the things that's moved people to check fraud is, for instance, EMV chips makes card present fraud like way more complicated. And fraudsters are like water, they seek the path of least resistance. But there's a lot of other technology tools that are at play here. There's a lot of new, in the old days, you'd say, well, there's Photoshop. Well, now there's like Photoshop on steroids in terms of things that you can do to like create counterfeit checks and cook checks and things of this nature. The other thing too, and I borrow from another researcher in the field, who points out that like check fraud, if you want to be a bad guy, is sort of an entry-level bad guy thing. It's a lot safer, by the way, than if you were a drug dealer, when you're doing check fraud, people don't shoot at you. So it's safer in that regard. But it's not as complicated as a number of other far more intricate and complicated elements of fraud. And so that's why, to his perspective, you see a lot of people moving into the check world. And then it's a word of mouth, kind of like the person across the street just bilked somebody out of $7,000 doing check fraud, and you're like, that sounds like a pretty good idea. How'd you do that? And that's how these things get going.
Yeah. Anything else, Ron, to add to that one?
Nope. I'll let Mike with the last word on that one.
Yeah, very interesting, you know, in terms of how they move from one payment method to the other. It's, you know, finding that hole and taking advantage of it as much as you can
Yep.
before it's closed and another one opens.
By the way, sorry, Kerry, let me just jump in with one thing. Because we're talking about check fraud, we got, you know, checks on our mind, and that's all good. But it's sort of like, okay, that's enough of the checks. Let's go talk about the future, which is, you know, real-time money movement using mobile phones and all the rest of it. I mean, now that's a whole nother that's a whole new can of worms, right? You know, so it's not like
Yeah,
check is getting this attack because all these other payment methods are like really well buttoned up. You know, you just got a whole series of other problems in some of those other areas too.
that's right. Yeah, they definitely all have their challenges, which kind of leads into the next focus, and that's around how, you know, to balance customer experience, expectations for the customer. We talked about funds availability, right, and risk management, right? So how do you know, how are the banks doing? You know, what are those, you know, if you look at kind of the customer experience on the utility side, the factors that matter most and are the most important to customers. How well are banks doing when we think about happy mobile banking consumers or customers? So, like, you know, from the analysis on utility run or experience, let's kind of talk about what are those things that our customers are very happy with and their experience around that, and then some of the challenges, and tying that not only to the just general mobile banking experience, but then tying that maybe to some fraud lenses that we've heard throughout the analysis and the survey results.
Sure. I've alluded to it a little bit before, but there is a high level of satisfaction from especially both consumers and small businesses with the mobile deposit experience, and really with the overall mobile banking experience. And in fact, a very strong correlation between the mobile deposit experience and ratings and their overall. So it's clearly a driver of overall mobile banking success. You know, I think in the industry, we have talked about the desire for the quote frictionless experience for what, 10, 15, maybe even 20 years now. And I got to tell you, I think things are changing a little bit from a consumer expectation perspective, which means they actually want friction in some areas. And they want this to be, yes, they want funds availability and all of that, but they do want some friction from a security and protection perspective. And I think one of the things, and this gets reflected, I know we're not talking about the rankings just yet, but I think this gets reflected in the rankings for some of the more higher ranked financial institutions in the ranking, that those who are doing better are doing a more concerted and better job of communicating and keeping in front of the customer information about the status of things, setting expectations appropriately. You know, the reality is it's going to take time to clear. You want it to take time to clear so that there can be fraud protections applied to this. I think consumers are more accepting of that today because of what they hear in the news and what a growing number of them are experiencing. So I think ironically, friction's not the bad guy that we make it out to be sometimes, and I think that that's been really reflected in consumers' expectations these days.
Yeah, I just jumping in here. I'm just smiling. As Ron was talking, I'm thinking somebody needs to do a meme where like the left panel says, you know, 2010, and it just says, just say no to friction with the bank consumer, and then 2023 would just say yes to friction. You know, there is a time where banks would and payment companies and so forth would, and still is true, and understandably, if you want access to the funds sooner, if you want this to go faster, pay me a convenience fee. I can almost see a future where it's like, I'll pay you to go slower, right? I'll pay you to slow this down and just make sure everything's aligned before you transfer this money from my account to this other thing. So we're definitely, to Ron's point, it's a new era, and there's some irony for sure.
Yeah, it's the are you sure kind of button. Is it the, hey, we noticed you made this payment, here's the status of it, right? So providing that information along and the reasons why, right? Justification for their own protection, right? That education point, Ron, that you said, right? If you tell them, those that do really well communicate really well about, right, the experience or the process. And so that's, I think, an important part of friction or no friction based on, right, the relationship the bank has with their consumer.
Yeah, hugely important. I should say everybody's against dumb friction or friction associated with silos and all that kind of stuff. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But if you say friction for a purpose, friction to protect you, I think people, more and more consumers are like, hey, that's great, slow it down. Let's make sure.
Yeah, I see an audience question, but I think it's more of a statement, which is embrace intentional friction. I like that, right? Intentional friction.
Okay, whoever wrote that better get a trademark on that, because otherwise we're going to rip it off. So.
That's right. Okay, so then, like, you know, as FIs kind of think about this, results of the survey, we talked a lot about friction. Is there anything else FIs based on the utility analysis? And we'll get into the rankings and some of that. Ron, you're going to talk us through that. But on the consumer small business side, whether it's fraud or concerns for the consumers, where and the benchmark study you would recommend the FIs and the banks and the credit unions focus on as they look into this in more detail?
Mike, you want to go first, then I'll jump in?
No, go ahead.
I would say that, and I'll just echo my comments from a few minutes ago, the banks that are doing a better job of this overall are those that are communicating very proactively, and actually some that are doing it even outside of the mobile deposit experience. I'll got to check my notes on which bank it was that is actually sending text messages to its customers to confirm that the deposit was made and to set expectations. So it's you know, using the mechanisms they have to proactively communicate and set expectations about, you know, yes, we've got a confirmation and expectation. And I think the banks that in the rankings that have done better are those that are thinking about new ways of doing it and getting beyond sort of the mobile deposit box.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, I think using all communication methods that make sense to the consumer, right? How that they communicate is very important, Ron, like you said, right? So if it's text, is it through their mobile? Is it email, right? Making sure that widespread, you know, understanding where your customers like to be communicated to and then how they want to be communicated to, I think is part of kind of that education thing that we keep going around, right? And communicating and helping the customer through the journey as well from a payment processing perspective.
And
so let's go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I might add into what Ron was saying is that in terms of these messages, one of the things that this has been great in watching the evolution of this throughout the years of this mobile deposit benchmark study. Because in the early days, you know, we kind of noticed that a lot of the communications with the customers during the experience and after the experience appear to have been written by attorneys within the bank, right? And boy, they were harsh. Like if you're a consumer, you're finished, instead of a green check mark or your funds will be available on such and such a time, there was a lot of like, you know, store your check in a safe in a cool dark spot for, you know, 2 months and do this and do that, and a lot of legalese. And I think that the industry has come a long way. Kerry used the term of the journey, and thinking about the journey in the context of a human, a real human that is a relative of anybody on this call, and understanding how they would want to be communicated with by their financial institution. Just very basic stuff. Let me know what's going to happen next, what should I expect?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so hey, Ron, how about we dive in to the top 5 rankings and what they were doing, what they're doing well, and how that ranking and results came around from a mobile banking experience perspective and the dynamics that went into that analysis?
No, I'm thinking we can keep people waiting a little bit longer. No, just kidding. All right, so next slide, Aaron, if you will. The top 5, well, US Bank is now year number 2, second year in a row at the top. 2 and 3, I believe, are unchanged. No, I think Wells and Capital One flip-flopped. This year, Wells was 3. Last year, they were 4. And Capital One was the 3 last year. And then congrats to Citizens Bank for cracking the top 5. They had been increasing and inching up the rankings over the past couple of years and hit the top 5. And then we gave honorable mention for most improved in user experience to Wells Fargo, who continues to, and that helped them bump up a spot to number 3. We want to see the broader rankings before we kind of get into some of the details, or else, no, actually, I'm not thinking we're not going to do the comparison. I forget whether or not we have that slide in there or not. I don't know. Mike, any comment you want to make before we go to the next slide?
No, other than just to really say, like at this stage of the game, sort of Mitek sponsors a lot of this, and then we just sort of step back and we're in the audience just like you guys are. So, I'll let you keep on going here, Ron.
Okay. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, so we are skipping that. Okay. So here's the broader rankings with the heat map. The lighter blue is whether or not the institution was ranked in the top 5. A little bit darker blue, I'm not even sure that's a blue color anymore, like teal maybe. I don't know, we got to figure out a better heat map thing, right? Ranked 6th to 10th, and then orange 11th to 15th, and then the more red color 16th to 20th. So what this really says is that US Bank is doing a really good job across the board, across all 8 heuristics, with a slight knock against US Bank for their deposit limits, which is it's a policy decision that the bank makes and is going to continue to make it. And if they really wanted to ensure number 1 ranking, they would change that, but I doubt they're going to do that. Chase, on the other hand, they have a little bit more restrictive deposit limits, which kind of penalize them a little bit more. And then Wells Fargo, same thing there. And then also another policy decision around the recommended paper check hold times, which was kind of ranked a little bit more restrictive. So overall, what really tends to happen here is that among the leaders, the user experience is not significantly different in terms of the rankings and the quality of that experience. Each of them have various different features that others might not. But listen, because we use both the policy decisions as well as the user experience elements in the ranking, that's what's going to kind of impact the ranking. But from a top 5 perspective, it really isn't that much of a difference in terms of the quality of the experience. Once you start getting down towards the 15th through 20th, that's when we start to see real differences in the user experience in terms of efficiency of use, match between the system and the user world, consistency and standards, and errors and prevention in particular. Compared to the early days of this report, where not everybody had auto capture function, that is completely prevalent today. And real-time deposit status updates, only one bank, I think, really kind of stood out in terms of not having that. So we're moving towards a point where the real differences in the overall user experience are, number 1, driven by the policy decisions. And I will share this and perhaps get some pushback from Mike on this. We'll see how he feels about this one. But we actually asked consumers in the survey to rank the various elements of this ranking of what's most important to them. And it actually turns out that in the scheme of things, the policy decisions were not as important factor in their overall experience, but they're still incredibly important to those users in terms of their overall rating of the mobile deposit experience. So, maybe as we go forward, we'll rethink sort of the weighting of some of these factors. But clearly, all of them are very important to consumers in terms of overall, in terms of their overall mobile deposit experience rankings. So, okay, I'll stop and let Mike make some comments, and Kerry, you too.
Yeah, I don't know that I have too much to add. I think that sometimes on surveys and so forth, if you catch the person at the certain time where something occurred, right? Like they haven't had a deposit limit issue. One of the things that is you see checks are declining, but check values are going up, right? Checks are becoming more and more conveyors of larger dollar sizes and dollar amounts, which crashes into the deposit limit question. The other thing too is that in this benchmark study, Ron and team are treating deposit limits as a variant and a standard by which to evaluate different mobile deposit uses. However, in some ways, it could be an indicator of something much more broad, which is the degree to which a financial institution has smart limits that uses a lot of other technology to advise them. And that if a bank has less of that, they are forced then to go with more crude means of weeding fraudsters out, such as check limits and mobile deposit. So we're talking about it in the context of mobile deposit, but the presence of low limits and policy-based decisions might be an indicator of a broader opportunity for improvement within the financial institutions that's more broad than mobile deposit.
Yeah, I would agree. Intelligence, right, can drive a significant experience on availability. The more intelligence you have, not only about the deposit, but the relationship that you have with your customer allows you to be a little bit more flexible versus if you have a straight line policy out there that says all mobile deposit checks get a hold, period, right? 100% of a hold with no availability. So variance and intelligence and how you use that, has probably a good impact on, or negative impact on your customer experience. I was interested, Ron, and I don't know, like as you look at the study, because we did do some deep dive into small business, and this is a broad, like the utility scoring. Did we see, from the study that those that have small businesses tend to be challenged with the same issues that a general consumer would have? Are they going towards mobile deposit? What are the, the challenges that they have? Is it similar, right, in terms of availability, the challenges that may drive to their business? Are they a big user of mobile deposit, or they'd like to be but aren't able to? And some of the utility factors of ranking kind of make sense as you look at the challenges that small business has?
The short answer to that is yes, they do have many of the same issues and challenges as the consumer side. The more detailed answer, and I hate when I have to admit of weaknesses in the survey, but we'll take care of this and address it next year. The issue and where things get muddy is that many small businesses, especially those to the smaller side of small business, have consumer checking accounts. Mm-hmm. And it's not even small businesses; it's gig workers and other creators, people making money on YouTube and making money through Etsy and places like that. That muddies this water between what is a consumer and what is a small business owner or small business. And I think because many of the smaller small businesses have consumer accounts, they're subject to a lot of these deposit limits that are causing them trouble because sometimes they have large checks, or creators who might be getting checks or payments that are exceeding certain levels and limits. And the volume may be triggering off some fraud issues as well that are placing holds on accounts and things like that. So it is this gray area between the small businesses or non-pure consumers, and I think this is kind of the challenge. So many consumers now have multiple streams of income and get money from different places that it is Mike kind of alluded to. It's the institutions that are not personalizing and customizing the policies and really understand who their customer is. This is impacting the overall mobile deposit and mobile banking experience.
Very interesting. I mean, small business is a huge opportunity, and like you said, there's many in the, that need banking that have both, right? It becomes a blended consumer small business, experience for them, and something that's always, I think, maybe an opportunity as well as a challenge to consider for the banks as they look at the data. But that was something that I found was interesting when I was reading through the survey data. Okay, so any last thoughts on this or the kind of the rankings, Ron or Mike? I'll open it up for questions, but wanted to give you guys any last thoughts on just kind of what we've talked about so far.
Nothing on this. I know we have a couple questions queued up.
Yeah. Okay.
Only other thing I want to bring up before we get to other questions and move on to this is, Aaron, if you can go to the next slide. I did want to kind of talk about the impact and the effect of digital assistants or chatbots that have become very prevalent. We first started asking about this in last year's consumer survey, and this year I should have maybe shown the year over year. But number one, from last year when we did the survey, only about a quarter of consumers said that the bank that they did business with, or predominantly did business with, had a digital assistant or a chat bot. That percentage this year has grown significantly to almost a half. One thing that has been consistent as we've looked at the ratings, the mobile check deposit experience and the overall mobile banking experience ratings clearly show a difference between the financial institutions that have a digital assistant and those that don't. These numbers in the dark blue bar are up this year from last year slightly. And since this is on a scale of 1 to 10, we're not going to see huge jumps in this. But to go from, I think it was like 8.3 to 8.6 for mobile check deposit experience is pretty significant for those institutions that have a digital assistant. And some of the banks that get some of the better rankings in our study, like Bank of America, who have done a good job of integrating its chatbot Erica into the mobile deposit experience. This is having an impact in the ratings, both from a mobile deposit as well as overall mobile banking experience. And I think that as many more institutions start looking at chatbots or digital assistants, applying that to the mobile deposit experience is going to be very important to them.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, right? If you're having a challenge, whether it's a check deposit or a question in your mobile banking and you're not quite getting there, that chatbot or assistant can help you through that without it being a experience that ends with a no transaction, right? Or I didn't get the information I needed. So it makes a lot of sense in terms of the experience component from assistance that the consumer needs, the customer needs, that they just can't find in mobile banking right away, or that they need help performing a particular transaction. So very, very interesting finding, but it makes sense. Those that invest are seeing a difference there. Okay, so there's a couple questions. I'm going to start with this one, probably drive it to Mike around technology innovations. Would improvements in technology innovations that can prevent check washing, kind of the watermark copy, kind of some of the security features, some of those components help prevent much of the check fraud? I know check washing was a big concern of small business at top, but we do see a large variation. People are just depositing a check without even washing it these days. What do we think about technology innovations and how much those may be helping to prevent this fraud or can help prevent the fraud?
Well, I'm going to answer, and then I'm probably going to volley at the net here, Kerry, because of the three of us, only one of us has worked at a really big bank for our whole career. But the one thing that I will say is that the fraudsters are exposing a gap that has opened up because of the maybe understandable, but the lack of technology investment and innovation around check fraud issues anyway. So that's the gap, I would say, is attributable in part to that, right? And this is even including like
Yeah, I would agree with you. Check is a legacy product, right? It's been out there a very long time. Some of the electronics like ACH have been as well, but investment, when you look at what's happened in the industry over the last 10 years, right, is this migration towards focus on P2P and real-time payments and some of those things. So some of those legacy solutions or payment methods like check maybe haven't gotten the investment, and so we have an environment definitely has started to hit us pretty strong, I think, from financials and across the industry. Probably when COVID, it was like, oh wait, we do have some gaps here, this is a big concern. I think if you looked at some of even the general industry survey results in different areas, checks started to become top of mind, where before it was like 5, 6, 7, 8 down on the list. So I think you're right, Mike. Continual investment, because the fraudsters are going to continue to iterate. They're very agile. Today they're going to do something, tomorrow they're going to try something else. So that continual investment, regardless of the type of payment, probably is something that is important to drive the answer to that question. Ron, anything you would add?
No, Mike covered it. I think the AI is the new opportunity, and it's multiple types of AI, as Mike mentioned.
Remember, the bad guys are using the latest technology, right?
Yeah.
So that's what you gotta remember that.
Yeah, and it's easy for them to find. Okay. Any more questions out there that you all see, Mike?
I think there was this question on just standard clearance time for mobile deposit checks. Kerry, do you want to?
Well, I mean, it does vary. I mean, Image Exchange has some standards, or it is a whole lot faster today than it was back in paper clearing time. But I think it does vary based on institutional processing. But it's pretty quick, and that's more like that industry kind of, which institution is clearing to what, and do they go through a consolidator? So it's kind of varied, but I would say, most are cleared within 5 to 7 days at the most, unless something happens in the process. But every financial institution has kind of a different process for clearing their items.
Right. Great.
Okay. I know there probably are some additional questions. What I'd like to do is just remind everybody that we will get back. The report will be released, and we appreciate you joining us today. We hope you get some additional insights and clarity around some things, from this survey and report that you can bring back to your institutions. Any questions we will respond to. We just appreciate the time. Mobile deposit. It's still critical. It's in that top, right? I mean, Ron, anything to add there before we close out?
I think I just reiterate the thing that both from a survey and so from an analysis perspective, high correlation between the level of satisfaction with the mobile deposit experience with the overall mobile banking. I don't think you have to convince anybody that mobile banking experience is important. But with all of the various features and functionality that's in mobile banking today, this is a make or break of the experience type of capability, because if this is not a good experience, that will weigh heavily on the consumer's overall mobile banking rating.
Right.
Mike, any key
Yep.
takeaways that and insights?
Yeah, one last thing, which is on the last bullet point. I remember meeting with a financial institution a number of years ago whose institution was on this report, and they, I think, brought up the rear. They were like last or second to last. So I had some trepidation about whether or not they were going to be grumpy with me, which like I'd have nothing to do with it, but I thought they might be grumpy. Turns out they were like, they thought it was great. They were like, that is awesome, because the whole point was now they had something that they could use to go kind of advocate for their customers inside their financial institution. They knew that they were kind of hamstrung by some internal policies and some issues inside the bank. And so I would say and they made those changes. US Bank, by the way, wasn't number one every single year, right? But they kind of looked at some of the stuff that came out of this report, and they applied those along with all sorts of insights and that they have, and look at where they are today. And so I would say using this as a tool internally is a really smart way to leverage this data.
Yeah, for any financial institution or credit union, big or small bank, right? It's really important to kind of learn. Customer intelligence is so critical, but also utility intelligence, which is a component of this report, is very good in terms of taking that back internally and having those discussions with stakeholders and leaders about the experience and what is working well for them and where they have opportunities. So it's great insight. So thank you, Ron and Mike, for your insights for this webinar. And again, any questions, we will follow up directly with those that submitted questions. We appreciate your time and thanks for joining us today. Everybody have a great afternoon.